happy to introduce Katie Ireland is going to give our rough cut talk. Katie got a BS degree from Utah State and a master's science from Montana State. She worked with Andy Hansen here. And then she went away to get a PhD, which she finished in 2013, and that was at Northern Arizona. So she's been around the West a bit. And now she's back working with Andy and on fire, climate, vegetation interactions. Past work focused on the interactions between aspen climate growth, mortality in the GYE in northwestern US, as well as fire climate interactions in ponderosa pine forests of the Southwest. And today she's going to talk about the work she has been doing here for the past few years, where she has been working with the natural resource managers to design management alternatives for whitebark pine and those communities in the GYE under future climate using simulation models to evaluate their effectiveness and maintaining the whitebark community. So, Katie.
All right. Thanks, Bruce, for the introduction, and thanks, everyone, for coming. So I'm going to talk, as Bruce mentioned today, about the work I've been doing with Andy Hansen and our colleagues, Bob Keene from the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Kristen Legg from the National Park Service, and Rob Gump, who's also from the Forest Service, trying to think about how to make climate adaptation planning spatially explicit. And we took as our example species for this project, whitebark pine. So I'll be talking a lot about whitebark pine in this talk, but I'm hoping some of the ideas of how we think about climate adaptation planning and how we make that spatially explicit might be applicable to other species that are vulnerable to climate change. So as most of the people in this room, I'm sure, are aware, climate change is expected to have a variety of different impacts on ecosystems, from shifts in species distribution to widespread forest die-off that's been recorded globally, to changes in disturbance regimes. As we've seen this year in Montana and in Northern California, we're seeing a large increase in frequency of fire, area burned, and severity of fire, and all of these are impacts predicted by climate change. As these impacts have been increasingly recognized, a variety of different climate adaptation frameworks have been developed. And here I'm just showing two examples. The Adaptation for Conservation Targets framework developed by Malay Cross, who works here in town at WCS, and the Climate Smart Conservation developed by Glick and others. And common to a lot of these frameworks are steps including identifying conservation targets, assessing those targets' vulnerability to climatic changes, identifying management options, implementing management options, and then monitoring the effectiveness of those. In practicality, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of vulnerability assessment, but very few projects have gone to the stage of implementation. And one of the problems, the barriers to implementation is exactly how and where, how do you put that implementation on the landscape? Exactly where on the landscape are different strategies to adapt to climate change for a variety of different resources going to be most effective? And it's been very difficult to make that leap to trying to plan spatially explicit climate adaptation. But one example comes from yellow cedar in Alaska, where Hennon and others reviewed the literature and the science on yellow cedar and came up with the idea of planning for climate adaptation by zones of climate suitability. For example, those areas which might become newly suitable under future climate might be considered zones of migration, and you might try to manage to favor dispersal to those newly suitable habitats. Areas where the climate conditions might remain suitable but not decline substantially and suitable might be persistent, and might be areas where you aim conservation and active management to try to maintain the species in that occupied habitat. And finally, there are those places where the climate suitability might be expected to decline, and species might in future become maladapted to those sites. So that might be an area that you don't plan really active conservation for a given species. And so this is one way to think about how you might plan climate adaptation in a spatially explicit manner. Moving to whitebark. In this area, whitebark is a keystone species in subalpine habitats throughout much of the West. but it has experienced notable decline in the last few decades as a result of mountain pine beetle infestations, blister rust, fire exclusion that has led to the increase in competing species. And here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's been estimated that there's been 80% mortality of the overstory adult population in the system. So there's a lot of concern for this species, and it was listed as a candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. There's a lot of reasons to care about whitebark pine. It's an important keystone species. It helps to delay snowmelt, maintain snowpack, stabilize soils as one of the few tree line species or tree species to occur at upper tree line. It facilitates the establishment of other tree species like subalpine fir, and it's an important food source to a variety of wildlife, including grizzly bears. So there's been historically a lot of concern for whitebark pine ecosystems, and it appears to be an early responder to climate change, making a good species to try to understand how we would manage under future climate change. In light of these threats, an interagency committee here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, formed a subcommittee focused on whitebark pine in 1999 and has been developing a region-wide strategy to protect the species. However, at the time they developed their strategy, which was published in 2011, there was relatively little information on the specific climate change impacts to whitebark pine. But recognizing this, the managers wrote into their strategy that they would try to incorporate available climate science as it improved and became more available, which is where this study comes in. So we worked with the managers very closely to try to ask what restoration strategies might be most effective at maintaining whitebark pine forests in the system under future climate change. And we really took two steps to this approach. First, we wanted to develop spatial management alternatives for the species across the ecosystem, and then try to evaluate the efficacy of those alternative management scenarios. And we turned to simulation modeling to do that. So first I'll talk about the different scenarios that we looked at, and then how we mapped them and how we evaluated them. So we chose 4 climate scenarios: historical climate conditions, which represent the climate between about 1980 and 2010. And then 3 climate scenarios that we selected based on previous species distribution modeling efforts. So Tony Chang was a PhD student with Andy Hansen, and he developed statistical correlation models predicting future habitat for whitebark pine based on its current habitat and predicted under future climate scenarios. And what he found were these 3 different, we bracketed our climate scenarios using his results. I have a mouse. This Hadley model under the species distribution results represented the worst scenario for whitebark pine in the future. This is a scenario where most of its climatically suitable habitat disappeared from the system. And then conversely, the CNRM-CM5 scenario was the rosiest future for whitebark pine under his results. And then we chose a mid-range scenario. So we're trying to bracket the range of potential conditions for whitebark pine in the system. And then our 3 management alternatives were a no management alternative, where we just allowed, in the simulation, we allowed all natural processes to move forward without any kind of management impacts. And then a spatial implementation of the current Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee strategy. That does include financial and logistical constraints, such as not being able to place certain treatments in wilderness areas or far from roads. And finally, the climate-informed management, which is a bit of a pie-in-the-sky management alternative, where we spoke with the managers and we tried to come up with where you might put different treatments, such as thinning or planting or prescribed fire, just to try to maintain whitebark pine if that were your only goal, and if you had no constraints based on land classification or access or financial constraints. So it is the rosiest version. I did just want to take a minute to say this is a collaborative approach from the beginning. So we worked very closely with the managers to design the strategies, to ask them exactly how they would want them placed on the landscape, and then to review the results we're getting. And in fact, we'll be talking to them tomorrow to present the final results. So they've been closely involved throughout, and my management strategies reflect their thinking on the best way to put these management actions out on the landscape. The first step was we needed to develop a spatial implementation of their current strategy, because they have a document that guides managers on where to place treatments, but it's very site and stand specific and isn't implemented in a spatial way across the entire ecosystem. In speaking with the subcommittee, we came up with land classifications as being the easiest way to make this a spatial representation. Now, while different strategies, management actions might be placed on the landscape based on site-specific or stand-specific conditions, our approach was to develop zones where these are the tools in the manager's toolbox. And so if, for example, in multiple use forests, you have thinning, wildland fire use, and protection available to you as treatments, those are available, but you'd only implement those treatments if the site and stand conditions merit that. So for the current strategy, we mostly used land classification and access as the way to map out the tools available to managers. For example, not as many management treatments are available in wilderness areas as in general Forest Service lands. And you can't implement as many treatments when you're further from a road. So that's how we mapped the current management strategy.
What are the colors on the map? Purple is Yellowstone, blue and...
Yeah, purple is National Park Service wilderness, and yellow is National Park Service non-wilderness. And then blue is Forest Service and BLM wilderness. They had slightly, whether it was National Park Service or Forest Service, we had slightly different fire suppression in our simulation results. So that's why the wilderness is separated into Forest Service versus National Park Service.
And green?
And green is multiple use forest. So it's Forest Service or BLM that's not wilderness. And then not showing on the map is the other criteria, which was how far you are from a road or a trail. So different treatments were available if you're within a mile of a road or trail or further than a mile from a road or trail.
Is the Wind River Reservation considered?
We just considered it non-federal because we were working with the federal managers, so we were using their ideas. So it's kind of treated as its own. We don't really implement management on the non-federal lands in this project. Although we've definitely discussed with the managers that management is happening on those lands. So to do a more thorough job, we would need to include that. In thinking about climate change impacts on whitebark pine, it's important to think about not just the direct effect of climate, but also the indirect effects of climate on the other drivers in the system. So whitebark pine is influenced by mountain pine beetles that have caused quite a lot of mortality in this region. Blister rust, which is an invasive pathogen that causes them to die. Fire exclusion, because it is a very poor competitor. So as we've had fire exclusion, competition has increased and also regeneration has decreased. So climate, these factors work directly on whitebark pine, but they're also mediated by climate. So when we were thinking about how to implement the climate change-oriented management strategy, we wanted to include as many of these drivers as possible. However, what I'm going to talk to you about is just including the impacts of climate changes on whitebark pine and the indirect impacts of climate change through competition on whitebark pine. And the reason we didn't include fire or beetles or blister rust is that there were not spatially explicit predictions of future climate impacts on those at the scale of the entire ecosystem and across all of whitebark pine's distribution within the ecosystem. So in future, it would be nice to include those, but they were not included in our planning of the zones. They are included in the simulation modeling, however. So our approach to developing climate adaptation planning, while the climate-informed management strategy, was like the example of yellow cedar, to take the approach of considering organizing management by climate zones. And to do this, we had predictions of historical whitebark pine climate suitability, from species distribution modeling work conducted by Tony Chang and Andy Hansen's lab. And that represented the climate suitability for whitebark between 1980 and 2010. And then we had his projected future whitebark pine climate suitability for each of 3 climate scenarios and for multiple different time periods. And so we simply overlaid these to develop climate zones, which we defined as core areas, being those areas that are suitable now and remain suitable into the future. Deteriorating areas decline in suitability in the future. And future habitat, which is currently unsuitable but might become suitable under future climate conditions. And you might manage in different ways in these different zones. So under the core habitat, we're trying to manage to retain the whitebark pine. Under deteriorating habitat, we might still implement some management treatments with the goal of managing to sustain the ecosystem function of the whitebark as long as possible. And then future habitat might be managing for natural or assisted colonization. And then once we had this, we also considered the impacts of future competition. So we had also predictions of climate suitability for some of the main competing tree species for whitebark pine. We had predictions of suitable habitat for Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, lodgepole pine, and Douglas fir. And we combined these to create a risk of future competition and a spatially explicit map. And then we took this combination of climate zones and future risk of competition to the managers and asked them, okay, if you're in a core zone and the risk of competition is high, you'd want all of the different tools available. So you might want a different suite of tools available in the deteriorating zone or the future zone. And so these tables reflect the manager's thinking on what types of tools they might want available in these different scenarios. And then we simply overlaid these and took the table, and what we end up with is a spatially explicit map of all the different treatment zones available to you. And you can see here that sometimes more than one treatment is available. For example, all the treatments are available here in the core habitat that has a high risk of future competition, so that would be these green zones here on the map. And so, or in some cases, only thinning is available. So you have different zones. And then these are going to be fed into the simulation model to determine what treatments are available as the simulation progresses through time. Just at the scale of the entire GYE, in general, for the planting, thinning, and mountain pine beetle protection treatments, the gray boxes here are the different climate change scenarios, and the white is the historical conditions. And you see in general, there's a lot more area being treated under the climate-informed strategy than under the current strategy. And this makes a degree of sense because under the climate-informed strategy, you're able to treat a lot more area. You're not being restricted by wilderness. You're not being restricted by access or logistical, any of those constraints. So even though, and you're also implementing some treatments even in deteriorating zones. So even though the climate suitability might be declining, you might still be trying to implement some treatments in those future climate change scenarios. The exception is the wildland fire use scenario where it was available, that treatment was available across most of the land classifications in the current strategy, and in the current strategy it was available pretty much whenever you could use it, but it was more constrained in the climate-informed strategy. Yeah. I'm sorry, the x-axis is management scenario, so it's current historical conditions and the 3 different climate change scenarios. And the y-axis is the proportion of the GYE treated. And then the numbers in the bars are the actual acres, but you probably can't see those.
So sorry, I'm still on the x-axis of the second, third, and fourth, which is the one that's.
So these are the white bar is historical climate, and then the Hadley was based on species distribution model predictions. That was going to be the worst future for whitebark, and the CNRM.
Meaning Doug first competing with it?
Just meaning that's purely climate suitability. So it's the one where climate suitability decreases the most. And the CNRM, CM5, yeah, where's my mouse? This guy, the lightest gray bar, that's the rosiest future. That's the climate change scenario where climate suitability was highest from species distribution modeling predictions. They're not terribly different in the area treated, but they are different from historical.
And the units on the vertical axis?
As the proportion of the GYE treated. Yeah.
Help me understand how the climate suitability maps are derived. So I'm particularly interested in kind of the lower bound elevation where these things will grow. Is there a boundary there because the trees just will not grow outside of that area, or is it that they'll be outcompeted outside?
Well, species distribution modeling, you take the current distribution of the species and what the climate is in that current distribution, and you build a statistical relationship. And then you just apply that relationship to future climate.
But when we say that, I mean, if I took a whitebark pine and I found a burned area at, say, 6,500 feet, and I planted it there and put a little fence around it, will it grow or will it die?
It could grow, and that's the problem.
So that's a suitable habitat for that species, but it's just other species do even better there.
This is the problem with species distribution modeling, is they only consider the climate and only implicitly, not explicitly, consider other factors that are important to a species. So they don't include disturbance. They don't include, they're working with the realized niche and not the fundamental niche of a species. And so it's implicit because competition has already filtered out where the species currently lives. And disturbance has already, and dispersal ability have already filtered out where the species is. So you're saying, when you use a species distribution model, that the climate where you see the species is the climate the species can tolerate, and not really recognizing that it might be able to tolerate climatic conditions outside of that envelope. And we'll get into that later.
Go through this figure again. I'm sorry, I'm just being a dunderhead about it. I don't know what you're showing here.
I'm simply showing that these are the area of the GYE that's treated under each of my, that's like prioritized where planting might be an available treatment, or thinning might be an available treatment. And this is the area that would be available for planting under the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee's current strategy. And this would be the area that is available for treatment for planting under the climate-informed strategy developed for the Hadley GCM. Does that make sense? A little bit hard to explain. Are we good?
Once again, on fire use,
Yeah.
It's going to shrink no matter what happens, the whitebark pine area.
Mm-hmm. Or fire use, you're saying you're going to implement fire in less of the habitat. And I think that's because some of the competition is declining and they're not putting fire in the places where there's lower competition risk. Yeah.
So, question on competition. So you listed Southern Alpine fir purely as competition. Does this also look at its importance as a coexistence species for persistence?
I'm using competition to help design where we might put management strategies. When we get to the simulation modeling, it just grows the species according to their physiological constraints. So it has the ability to coexist. It has the ability to be facilitated by whitebark pine. But
I guess I'm thinking the other way around. So in terms of management strategies, the existence of subalpine fir is really important for persistence of whitebark pine. And so if you just clear it all out as a competitor, you've got a problem, right?
Yeah, we did consider just mostly thinning, competition removal thinning for a management strategy when other species were present.
So there is a life cycle model at the heart of it.
Okay. Yeah. And the management strategy, we did say, like, if this stand is in a zone where thinning is available as a treatment, and if the basal area is over a specific threshold, retain all the whitebark and get rid of all the other species.
So that, yeah.
So it's pretty
and
simplistic.
And that's a real problem, right?
Yeah.
If you get rid of the well-height conversion,
Right.
it's all sufficient.
Yeah.
System.
So this is just a, that's all right. It's okay. Then I have some more complicated graphs that might be even more problematic. This is just to show spatially what this looks like. So for an example, here's planting under the current management strategy and under one of the climate-informed strategies. And the light green colors are areas that planting would be available as a treatment. And the light gray areas are the areas where planting would not be available as a treatment. And so you can see relatively little area being available for planting under the current strategy and quite a bit more area being available under the climate-informed strategy. Yes, Krista?
Availability just means that according to the criteria of whether it's suitable habitat,
Yeah.
not a specific designation.
Right. It says planting would be in the toolbox here, based on climate suitability and based on predicted suitability for competing tree species. It doesn't say it's actually going to necessarily be implemented there.
Available means it might be useful.
And yeah, it means it could be an appropriate strategy to use in this location. And this graph is just to try to help explain how land classifications feed into these results. So again, the white bars are the current strategy and the gray bars are different climate informed strategies. So different strategies under the different climate change scenarios. And then we have the different land classifications. And so you can see here, there's current, here's the climate formed. And so current is placing proportionally more planting in multiple use forests, but it's putting no planting treatments in the wilderness, where most of the planting treatments under climate informed strategies are being placed in wilderness areas. So it's really, the wilderness designation is having a huge impact on the difference between where these different strategies are placing treatments. But just to go back to this diagram, so we've talked about how fire and beetles and blister rust and nutcrackers and dispersal and climate all impact whitebark pine, and they're all mediated by climate, but our mapping of these strategies, we've mapped out what's available, but we're able to consider climate and competition. So, you know, do we really know? Maybe we're planting in a lot more area under the climate-informed strategy, but is it actually going to be effective at maintaining the species in that area? To answer that question, we turn to simulation modeling. And we use this model developed by Bob Keene with the Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula through the Forest Service, called FIREBGC version 2. And there's several reasons we chose this model. It's a mechanistic, spatially explicit tree model. It involves a lot of ecosystem process simulation. It includes fire, ignition, and spread. We can include multiple species, so we can include the different competing species in the understory and so forth. And we can include different age classes of all the different species represented in the model. Also, it operates at multiple spatial and temporal scales, so you have processes that cross scales and cross daily to yearly time steps. But importantly, it captures climate, fire, vegetation interactions, which we think are really important to whitebark pine. It simulates the processes like blister rust and mountain pine beetle that are very important to whitebark pine dynamics. And importantly for this study, you can implement management actions and you can implement them spatially by different zones. And it will only implement those management options within a zone once the stand conditions meet certain criteria. Like I was saying, so thinning is available in this zone, but you're not actually going to implement a thinning treatment in the simulation unless the basal area reaches a specific threshold. And you're only going to plant at certain levels of trees per hectare and so forth. And so we spoke to the managers and we developed our planting and thinning guidelines based on their recommendations within each of these different zones. And that's for both the current strategy and the climate-informed strategy. The criteria in the management actions were the same, just where they could be placed on the landscape differed. I guess any other major difference that I'll get back to later is that the current management strategy had a much higher level of fire suppression and across much more of the landscape than did the climate-informed strategy. I won't go too much into the details of the model, but it's spatially explicit. It's designed to incorporate disturbance and succession. It's organized at several different scales from the landscape scale, which is then divided into sites, which are like potential natural vegetation types. They're areas of biophysically similar topography, soils, species composition. And those are static on the landscape, but they're composed of stands, and the boundaries of those stands can shift over time in response to disturbance and succession. You can parameterize any number of species that you'd like, that you can find the right life history parameters and physiological parameters for. And then it simulates individual trees within a stand, and it simulates processes like respiration, photosynthesis, growth, litter fall, fuel buildup. Most of those important processes occur at the stand scale, but processes like fire occur across many different scales. So that's my brief synopsis of the model. So we have this treatment map, zones of treatment for the entire Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but it would not be computational feasible with this particular model to implement it across the entire GYE. So we selected a few landscapes that were roughly representative of climate suitability for whitebark pine under future climate conditions, and had a range of poor, deteriorating future climates, and also were roughly representative of different land classifications like wilderness and BLM or Forest Service lands. And then we spoke to the managers about which ones of those landscapes they would most be interested in. And we ended up down here in the Wind River Range, about a 200,000 hectare landscape. We'll get more into the composition of it in the next slide. So as I said a minute ago, FIREBGC divides the landscape into sites, which are like potential natural vegetation, and we derived these from land fire classifications. And the two that I would point out are this purple color, which is the spruce fir type. It makes up about 46% of the study area. And this light blue color is the whitebark pine dominated site, and those are the ones that we were most interested in. They comprise most of the landscape. This kind of brownish stuff is high alpine tundra shrub vegetation, and this down here is dry shrub, sagebrush, and juniper. And we designed a simulation experiment where we looked at all 4 levels of our climate. So again, that's historical, and then the Hadley model, which was under species distribution modeling, was the worst possible future for whitebark pine, then the mid future and the high future for whitebark pine based on species distribution modeling. So we did that to bracket the range of future climate conditions for whitebark pine. And then we have these 3 different management activities: no management, the current management that has the logistical constraints in it, and the climate-informed management that is based on those discussions with managers and more aimed at just maintaining whitebark at all costs. And so we did all the combinations of these, and we ran some replicates through the model. So this map is showing on the y-axis the proportion of the landscape occupied by any type of whitebark pine. And the different colors are: green is under historical climate, brown is under the Hadley model, purple is under the CESM, the kind of the mid-range model, and blue is that species distribution model said was the best future for climate. And you can see we get really different results than the species distribution modeling would suggest, where under the species distribution modeling, the Hadley model, that brown box, was supposed to be the worst future for whitebark pine. In our case, it's the best. In fact, there's more whitebark pine on the landscape there than there is under historical climate conditions. And there isn't a big impact of management. If you look at these boxes, there's a little bit less whitebark pine on the landscape under the current management, but there's not much difference between the no management scenario and the climate-informed management scenario. And we'll try to explore why that might be. But it's also interesting to look not just at the landscape as a whole, but at different spatial divisions of the landscape. So the whitebark pine sites are those sites at the upper tree line where whitebark pine is the dominant species. And up there, we see more what we might expect. We see generally decreasing proportional abundance of whitebark pine under all the future climate scenarios. Whereas at spruce fir sites, just below the whitebark pine sites, you actually get an increase in whitebark pine, especially under that Hadley model, but a little bit under the other two climate models as well. And you get a lower presence again under current management, similar to what we saw at the landscape scale. So we tried to look at this with a mixed effects model, and we put climate and management and interactions between the two and interactions with fire into the model. And we found significant interaction between climate and management, and between climate and management interactions. You can see it's varying over time, although that interaction between climate management and year isn't necessarily significant. What really jumps out again is this Hadley model just being hugely more whitebark pine in the landscape. And again, not much difference between the no management and the climate-informed management. These are the estimates of the model on the y-axis for the proportion of landscape occupied. And this is the simulation year from 0 out to 500 on the x-axis, and the different colors are the different scenarios. So the Hadley model is in brown, the historical model is in green. And again, we're still confused about what's going on. So we're saying, well, what we're really interested in is the end of the simulation, when the landscape has come into equilibrium with the climate. What's happening? What are the differences between the different management scenarios and the different climate scenarios at year 500? And so we did a multiple comparison, and this is looking at how management, how the proportion of landscape occupied by whitebark pine differs by management strategies within the different climate scenarios. And on the y-axis are the estimates of the proportion of the landscape from the model, from the mixed effects model, and the 95% confidence intervals, and then significance letters. So to walk through it, under historic conditions, management doesn't matter. They're all the same. Under the Hadley model, and under actually all three of the future climate scenarios, no management and climate-informed management are essentially the same, and you see a reduction in the estimated proportion of landscape occupied by whitebark pine under the current management scenario. Look at it another way, we can also look at how climate scenarios differ within management scenarios. And what we see here is that climate scenarios seem to have a larger impact on whitebark pine presence than management does. In all cases, the Hadley model predicts a larger proportion of the landscape being occupied by whitebark. And then the CNRM model is pretty much always the same as historic conditions. And the season one sometimes is the same, and sometimes there's a slight decline in whitebark pine abundance. So what factors might be driving changes in whitebark pine presence? Changes in species composition, we've talked about competition making a difference. So how does change in whitebark pine presence relate to changes in the presence of competing tree species? Maybe there's some changes in structural composition that would be important to look at. Which structural stages of whitebark pine or the other tree species are present under different scenarios? And finally, disturbance. How are fire regimes changing under future climate and management? And what impact do those changing fire regimes have on species and structural composition? I'll walk through this graph slowly because it's complicated. But these are changes in species composition at the landscape level. So again, we're looking at the proportion of landscape occupied, and simulation year on the x-axis. So the green color is whitebark, purple is spruce, pink is subalpine fir, and brown is lodgepole pine. So just looking only under the historical climate conditions, got a fair amount of lodgepole pine in the system. about equal proportions of whitebark and subalpine fir and relatively little spruce. And there's really not much difference between all those different management scenarios. They're pretty similar. If we move to just the Hadley model, you see a striking decline in the competing tree species and a huge increase at about year 200 in the whitebark species. Again, slightly less whitebark in the current management, but there's not a lot of difference in management scenarios.
What makes you think equilibrium was reached in 500 years?
Did a lot of calibration runs of 500 years under historical climate to look at how things were changing, and we didn't see much change after 500 years. Wait. Well, we keep getting more fires, I think, is the and we did our calibrations under historical climate, not under future climate. So I don't know.
Once again, in the green is where you think whitebark doesn't really like it so well. Is that right?
Yeah, no, so this is the scenario that we thought from species distribution. The Hadley model is the scenario that we thought whitebark pine wasn't gonna like.
That's right.
But the green here is the whitebark pine, what it's doing, and it's increasing a lot.
That's what it's doing overall, or in the places that we don't expect it to like very well.
This is overall, this is at the landscape scale. In this sort of mid-range climate scenario, they're all the species are lower than under historical conditions, but whitebark isn't really increasing the way it was in the Hadley model, and we still have some spruce and fir around. And here, again, I think it's a little bit more apparent that the current management is maintaining more of the spruce and fir on the landscape than the other two management scenarios are. And finally, this, what should have been the rosiest future for whitebark pine. Again, not a large difference in management, and they're all kind of, there's maybe a slight increase in whitebark pine over historical conditions, but not much. So if you look at it all together, there is sort of an overall decline in the area occupied by any type of forest in future climates, except for maybe Hadley with the whitebark pine taking over the landscape. Management in general doesn't make a lot of difference. In general, the competitors are decreasing, and we have this pronounced increase in whitebark presence under the Hadley model. Yeah.
A lot of these simulations show kind of a trajectory over the first 50 years, and then it starts getting into some trajectory. Is that just momentum in the system, given the current situation, that the things are just, we already have a stock of trees and they're going to do something for a while until they die. Then once that current stock of trees dies, then we can start seeing these processes work out.
It's a little bit of that. So they're all initialized with the same conditions. So it's taking some time to just adjust and like grow through. And actually, if you think about it, we've initially as the model using plots from today, which have not had fire for a long time, and then we're putting fire in the model, so they're adjusting to a new disturbance regime. But there is also the fact that for the climate change scenarios, climate change is implemented over the first 100 years of the simulation. So it's about year 100 that you start really getting that new climate impact. So it's a combination of both of those.
It's brought on gradually.
It is, yeah. It's applied through an offset where you calculate like what the landscape level change to temperature or precipitation should be, and then you implement that by each site and you increment it over the first 100 years of the model. Gradually. This just shows, this is, previous were the proportion of area occupied. This is showing the dominant species by basal area in all of the different climate scenarios. This is the no management alternative, since management wasn't having a huge impact. And this is at year 500. So these are just static maps in time. And then the purple, again, the colors are the same as before. Lodgepole is in brown. Subalpine fir is this pink purple is spruce and this greenish color is whitebark. And you can just see how whitebark is everywhere under the Hadley model, kind of everywhere under the season model too, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's mostly replacing a lot of the lodgepole. It's not really moving down here into the shrubland area. You can see that, but the point is just, you can see it spatially too, and you can see that it's less pronounced in that CNRM CM5 model that whitebark's moving all over the landscape. So to think about species composition, we found an overall decline of area occupied by any type of forest under future climate. Management doesn't make a lot of difference, except we see maybe a slight decrease in whitebark pine under the current management scenario. But climate-informed management did not differ from the no active management scenario. Competitors generally decreased, and there was this pronounced increase in whitebark pine presence under Hadley. And then whitebark pine presence was similar to historical levels or slightly decreased under the other two future climate scenarios. So does this mean the future is completely rosy under the Hadley model for whitebark pine? Not if you look at structural stage. I think it's important to think about the structural stages of the forest as we move into the future. So this is the dominant structural stage by different climate scenarios. And my legend is not showing up, but the browns are seedling sapling stages. The green is mature and the yellow are pole stages. And under the historical climate in the forested regions of the system, you have a mix of all those different stages. This is year 500, no management. Under the Hadley model and the other two to a lesser extent, you just almost have a complete conversion to a seedling sapling, younger aged forest. And you lose a lot of the mature and the pole trees, a little less so in that mid-range scenario than the other two. But in the Hadley model, even though we've seen this huge increase in whitebark pine, it seems to be almost entirely in the seedling and sapling stages.
Once again, this is 500 years. This is at climax. That's the way it's going to be forever. I'm a real Comanche.
Presumably, yes. This is after the model's been running for 500 years. This is that snapshot in time. And this is just to look at one of the scenarios as an example. Again, the same colors. The mature trees are in green. The yellow trees, or the poles are in yellow. The browns are the seedlings and saplings. And we're looking at year 100 and year 500 on the x-axis. And no management, current management, climate-informed management. Again, management doesn't make a big difference. You certainly have more forest under current management and more mature trees and more poles under current management, but the climate-informed and the no management are not terribly different from one another. You see overall a reduction in any of these structural stages in the landscape by year 500, and you see a larger proportion of seedlings by year 500 as compared to mature trees. Is there a question?
Can you think of a seedling stands or pole stands in Whitebark? Is that something that you have a vision of?
Not so much.
No, I don't either. I don't think of it.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
I don't either. Yeah.
You do?
Might argue, but let's hear it.
Okay. So now I want to just, these graphs are structural stages for all species. That's not just whitebark. So this is what I forgot to explain that. That's just all species. We're losing the mature trees, we're converting to seedlings and saplings. Think about just whitebark, but also I want to point out again how it differs by spatial scale that you look at. So now we're looking at a no management scenario and simulation year and the proportion of each of these structural stages on the x-axis. But we're going to look at the landscape overall at just those high elevation whitebark pine dominated sites and at spruce fir sites. And historically, we didn't have a lot of whitebark pine in the landscape overall. Most of it was in the whitebark pine stands, and the two bars are year 100 and year 500. And there was very little whitebark pine and the spruce fir sites. What was in the spruce fir sites was mostly seedlings. What was in the whitebark pine sites was about an even mix of mature and seedling sapling stages of whitebark pine. That's under historical climate. And I said that, and I said that. So when you look at the Hadley model and try to compare it to the historical model, you see whitebark pine increasing at the landscape scale. So if you look, at this bar versus this bar, we've got a large increase at the landscape scale. At the scale of whitebark pine sites, you're actually seeing an overall decrease in whitebark pine. At the spruce fir sites, you're seeing an overall increase in whitebark pine. That increase is largely driven by seedlings and saplings. You can see that we're losing the mature trees, but there's still some around. The proportion of seedling to mature is increasing, and then all of the increase that we're seeing is from seedling and sapling stages. And it's even at year 500. Yeah.
Can you help us understand generally what the causes of this are? So if the whitebark is like moving into higher elevation, but those are more prone to burning. So you're having greater area of whitebark, greater whitebark habitat, but it's like burning more.
I'm going to talk about fire next, but I think that most of the landscape changes that we're seeing are driven by fire, and that most of what's happening with the Hadley model is because it's particularly fire-prone future. I want to make sure to point out, though, that the mature trees, the mature whitebark pine trees, even though they're decreasing, they still exist in the whitebark pine sites. For this model, the mid-range climate scenario, whitebark pine kind of decreasing from historical conditions across all scales. We're seeing an overall conversion to those younger age classes. And the last model, you'll see a whitebark pine decrease in the whitebark pine sites, slight increase in the spruce fir sites, and a conversion, and most of that increase is seedlings and saplings. And we maintain a little bit more mature whitebark in this scenario that, as compared to the other two climate change scenarios. And so to recap what we talked about in changes in structural composition, overall across the landscape, across all species, a conversion to younger successional stages. Current management maintains slightly more poles and mature trees than the other management scenarios. Increases in whitebark under that Hadley model. The Hadley model is showing whitebark pine increase all over the landscape. It seems to largely be driven by seedling and sapling stages. We're not seeing mature trees established, a mature forest established under that model. You see a slight increase in the seedling, sapling, whitebark, and spruce fir sites. Whitebark presence declines in the whitebark pine sites, but some mature trees are remaining there as a potential seed source, and that could be driving how their seedlings are moving down into the spruce fir sites. So to get to why this might be happening, talk about fire. I think that increased fire is driving a lot of these landscape changes. Okay. So the box plots on the left are showing the cumulative area burned by management and climate scenarios. So the x-axis are the different management or climate scenarios again, where we have green is historic, brown is Hadley, purple is the season 1 mid-range kind of scenario, and blue, lost my mouse, blue is the CNRM scenario. And you see a large increase in the amount of fire across all of the climate change scenarios. And again, there is less fire under current management, but the climate informed and the no management are not different. And I think that is what drives a lot of why we don't see differences in management between the no management and the climate informed management is both of them have a high level of fire, and fire seems to be driving everything we're seeing. The current management scenario has a lot more fire suppression, and fire is less available across more of the landscape as a treatment option. And the graphs on the right are the area burned over the different management and climate scenarios. So this column is the current management. This is the historic climate scenario. So here's the historic climate scenario. It just has a lot less fire in general.
So does that conclusion mean that with the way the model is parameterized, Whitebark pine will respond better after a fire than spruce and fir will?
That's what it's showing us, yeah. They are,
Does that make you question the parameterization?
they are better at responding to fire than spruce and fir in general, I would say.
The Hadley's climate model.
Yeah.
It's run through FIREBGC, which then some climate parameters of the Hadley model. What is it that the Hadley model is doing, making more fires in FIREBGC?
I think it's so the climate offsets are implemented by season. So you divide the year into seasons and you tell the model whether the temperature is increasing or decreasing and whether the precipitation is increasing or decreasing and how much. And the Hadley model in general is drier in the spring and summer, if I remember correctly, than the other models, and warmer. I think it has more winter preset, but it's drier during most of the fire season, especially the spring. So I think that's largely what's contributing to the more fires. But we still have to explore exactly what it is that's causing that.
To do some sort of climate
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
elasticity analysis, and especially the life cycle as it runs to the fire.
Yeah.
That's some strange things going on.
Yeah, we're this again shows how much more fire there is in that Hadley model. It's just the whole landscape is burning all the time, and the cumulative number of fires that have burned by year 500, and most of that landscape has burned more than 30 times by the end of the simulation. So it's just, and so I think what's happening is the whitebark are being allowed to, they're able to regenerate in all those burns as seedling and sapling. And talking to Bob, he thinks that's because of the dispersal and the way the dispersal by Clark's nutcrackers is allowing them to just get everywhere in the landscape. And the serotiny of the lodgepole is not allowing them to mature in such a frequent fire regime that they're disappearing, because the fire is so frequent that they're not maturing and they're not existing up at the highest elevations, whereas there are a few mature whitebark pine trees hanging on at the top of the mountain as a potential seed source for down below. And because of the Clark's nutcracker dispersal, they're just able to get to all the burns, which may not be realistic.
Is there a seed survival?
There is, and there's an establishment parameter too. So.
Well, the seed doesn't last over the year. It's going to go this year or not, right?
Mm-hmm. But there's so many years that are burning that are.
No, you said there is a seed survival.
Yeah, I've got to check. I haven't looked for a while.
That make a big difference.
Yeah.
So
That's why we
will there
get
be,
seedlings forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so does, excuse me, I'm not thinking my Missoula friend's name right now. Does he believe that there's enough trees in these models? There's so, on the maps you showed,
Mm-hmm.
there are not very many mature trees.
Right.
And seedlings are certainly not making seeds.
No.
And saplings aren't making very many. So are there going to be enough seeds to maintain the seedling sapling populations?
I think they're mostly hanging on there at the whitebark pine sites at the top of the mountains, and that's really the seed source. There's still enough up there to produce the seeds, but they're not anywhere else in the landscape. So.
Are you close to finished?
Yeah, I am trying. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. More questions than I thought. I'll just really quickly say. This is landscape fire rotation, and again, it's just making the point that we have more fire under Hadley, and most of the fire is killing, most of the mortality is happening in the climate informed and the no management scenarios because there's more fire. So I'll skip through that. And the majority of that mortality is in Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. So, you know, the management impacts were small. Increase of whitebark pine under Hadley, regardless of management. No difference between no active management and climate informed. We get a landscape conversion towards younger size classes. Frequent fire seems to be leading to the loss of the competitor species and loss of large size classes. Fire is just too frequent for these seedlings and saplings to mature, but there's probably a seed source up at the top of the mountains. And just looking at some of the results that Bob has done for other systems in the East Fork of the Bitterroot, whitebark pine also increased under future climate scenarios, and treatments had a large impact, but then at the crown of the continent, whitebark pine decreased under climate scenarios. So just to point out that like landscape makes a difference, fire regime makes a difference. That's different from ours. Our results are a little bit more in line with what they found in the East Fork of the Bitterroot. When we mapped things out, we found areas where the climate-informed management strategies agreed with one another, and a small proportion of areas where they agreed with current management. So given that the results of the modeling are a little bit hard to understand because there's different climate scenarios and different systems, it seems like a first step towards management would be to prioritize areas where the current and the climate-informed management strategies agree with one another, and look at the areas where climate-informed strategies agree with each other, but not with current management as prime areas for experimental treatments and monitoring. And if our results are correct about fire, we might want to consider increased fire suppression or protection activities around mature trees. Fire protection we might want to prioritize it in a higher percentage of the landscape and allow fires to burn in areas that are favorable to whitebark pine establishment, but in a more limited context. And just to show you that, like, we had between 80 and 100% fire suppression occurring under the current management scenario, and about 50% under the climate-informed scenarios, and in a much lower percentage of the landscape. So that's why I think some sort of middle ground between those different levels of fire is probably desirable. And hopefully all of this will be applicable to other species.
Thank you.